This is Generous Theology, and today Chuck and Brock are taking a look at Professor Black's work in Chapter 23, The Nature of Intellect, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy.
Yeah, and how do you answer that as a Christian? So I think this spurs the development of the philosophical and theological vocabulary to discuss these topics. I think one of the things that's worth talking about, and let me go back. Earlier I said that there's a reason why I haven't gone into the details of the philosophers that Black lists here, and there is some real meat on the bones. So I think the reason why I haven't pushed in there is because this is a world, and these thinkers are talking about something in using a different language, using a different lexicon that's not easy to put in a box. And so rather than try to put these thinkers into a box and possibly get them wrong, I'm really looking for a reference or a resource that we can share with people that can go through and break out how we can really think about these thinkers more faithfully and represent them as they really are. One thing that my quick War of Cultures theme minimized, that I'm going to backtrack on a little bit here, is this idea that everything Islamic is all of one piece. And that's just not true. You and I have talked about that before. Avicenna represents maybe the classic or this golden age of Islam. He was born and lived in the heartland of the early Islamic caliphates of the first few hundred years. So he's an Islamic thinker speaking from the heart of that Middle Eastern place and period. But then Averroes is a later thinker, maybe a century or two later, and he's from the complete opposite side of the Islamic world. So he is, in fact, born in Spain, died in Morocco. And in some sense, Averroes is maybe already that mediating step. So Averroes has had a very small impact, if any, on the Islamic world of the East. So it's primarily in the West that he's had the greatest impact. And maybe he is the pre-Aquinas here and the pre-scholasticism. I think that's worth looking at and thinking about. So these ideas, like you talk about the emanation, comes directly from Aristotle's position in the De Anima that was talking about how this concept that, I don't have my Aristotle quote here, I wish I did, but it's the idea that everything needs to have its prior cause when we're speaking about material reality. So in the physics, everything has a preceding cause. Aristotle thus establishes what we can today call a materialistic determinism. We sometimes call this a causal chain. And so that's just the idea that everything in the natural world is a result of all the previous interactions in the natural world. And I agree with that. I think it's true. It's a true form of determinism for what it is. But what it doesn't speak to, and where all the interesting thinking ends up happening, is it does not apply when it comes to the metaphysics, or that which in the Aristotelian view was beyond physics. And so when you stop thinking just about the materialistic world, and when you start including, for example, the interactions of moral agents, such as people, such as God, such as other entities or beings, spiritual beings that may be around, you can't possibly speak of those things with the materialistic causal order. And so you have Avicenna coming here in the West, and of course he's Islamic, but he's Islamic in the sense that's who he is, but his impact was much greater on the Christian world than it was on his own world. And what are we going to do? And so the answer in the High Middle Ages, so you could almost put the early Middle Ages as the pre-Aristotelian time period. And then the High Middle Ages was the medieval thinkers in doing this encounter, having this reaction to the Islamic thinkers, and then finally culminating in the high period in Thomism. And then when you come out of the High Middle Ages and you go into the later part of the Middle Ages and towards the Renaissance, you really have the ultimate, let's just say, failure or breakup or divorce, what Black here calls the decline of the Aristotelian framework. And so Occam here is one of the chief architects of a form of skepticism that ends up making the Aristotelian framework just not hold, and it just starts to collapse. And so that's the transition there in the Renaissance and in the pre-modern period, let's call it, is really signifying this fact that For 1,000 years, thinkers had read and studied Aristotle to bootstrap our vocabulary and lexicon on how we're going to talk about things. And it's really in the Middle Ages that falls apart. And it's really at the hands of skepticism and the inability of these concepts to unify the cultures. And so that brings up what's going to be the problem of modernity, which is what to do about Occam, what to do about skepticism, and what value to place upon these unified theories of everything. Chuck, how does that sound to you as a summarization? Or is that faithful? How did it seem to you?
I think it is. It's interesting to me, and you drew these two threads and brought them together, which I think is good, and I appreciated. In people like William of Ockham, and Ockham seems to be the guy we keep pointing to week after week, we have both the idea of a skepticism, which clearly that skepticism becomes a very big part of later thinkers. But you also have this real desire in Occam to have, he might not have used the term a grand unified theory, but he does want to simplify it. He wants to make that the whole idea of the Occam's razor is the simplest solution, the one that has the least amount of complexity added onto it, he would say is the best solution. And we've found in our day-to-day life that we often find that Occam's razor to have some level of truth to it, which is why it's so popular. But there is a sense in which we see that as well having a major impact on later thinking. And even today, there's a lot of desire on the parts of physicists and others involved in science to have this simple, and by simple, I don't mean that it's easy, but a theory that really can deal with everything. And how important that really becomes. Albert Einstein he really was searching after when he came up with this theory of relativity. He's looking for this grand unified theory of everything. And we see this already in Occam earlier. So yeah, it's really interesting. There's one other piece that I wanted to, just as since we're wrapping up here, that I wanted to think about as well. It is interesting that there is this correspondence or this communication between the Islamic world and the Christian world, and there is some separation, as you've pointed out, and even the fact that people like Averroes and Avicenna may really have had more impact on the Christian world than on the Islamic world, especially perhaps the modernist world. But I wonder whether there is a sense in which going back to some of the conversations that happened during this era that we're reading may be a useful task to do together with other thinkers, and including Islamic thinkers. And one of the things, and I think I've told you this story before, but one of the things that gets me thinking about that is that I think there is a sense in which conservative Islam sees Christianity and secularism as being from the same cloth. They see us all together. And we confessional Christians would argue that. And they say, hey, you miss a whole lot of stuff you don't understand. But there is a sense that oftentimes what especially more fundamentalist Muslims are rebelling against is this idea that Christianity and sort of Western secularism are sort of part and parcel of the same thing and need to be fought against. And yet, on a more individual basis, I think I've told you the story of how when my father was a PhD student at the University of Iowa, and he was a little older than most of the other PhD students, he had his academic career for quite a while with his multiple master's degrees and hadn't gone for his PhD, and the college wasn't requiring him to. But my mother, who got into academia a little later, didn't have the same benefits that he did and was told she had to go and get her PhD. So he went along with her, and they did that. And he got to be friends with a Muslim from Iran by the name of Mohammed, or Mo, he called him, who, as it turns out, there at the University of Iowa, they found as a professing Christian and as a believing Muslim, they found that they actually had more in common in a lot of ways than either of them did with the overarching secularism that you found at the University of Iowa. And while certainly we don't go into this thinking, There's so much similarity between Islam and Christianity that we can overlook the real differences in the systems and who God is and who Christ is and those kinds of. I also wonder whether there's a sense in which Christians may, in battling against the ideas of secularism, may find that it is once again of some value to engage with others, including Muslims, but probably other religious systems as well, as a way of together looking at these ideas, these old ideas that maybe have been put away by modern secular Western thinkers, and to reconsider them based on what we know now, because there is a sense in which we always do build on each other to talk about what Isaac Newton used to say, we sit on the shoulders of giants. But perhaps as Christian thinkers and perhaps other religious thinkers as well, we may want to think about, hey, there's some of these other giants that we're starting to forget about, starting to not to use their shoulders, and that there may be a way of engaging together, not for the purpose of saying, hey, we're completely allied, but for the idea of perhaps arguing against some of the concepts in secularism that we don't agree with, and finding some common ground for making those arguments, and for learning from each other, as to for both the good and the bad happened during medieval times, with thinking about Islamic thinkers and Jewish thinkers and Greek thinkers, along with the Christian thinkers who had come before.
What a beautiful wrap up. Thank you, Chuck. That was awesome. This has been such a profitable chapter. Are we ready for 24, do you think? Is that our next step?
I think so. I think we're ready for 24. In reading 24, I don't know if you've gotten through it, I found 24 to be another one of those chapters. We've had a couple of them that by itself, it was like, I don't know how much I got out of it until I engaged with some of the other chapters that come after. So I actually read 25 this week as well. And there's a lot of good that comes out of both of them. But I think there's enough in 24 to start with that maybe if we just focus on 24 next week, and then as we move forward, I think as we go into 25 and maybe into 26, which I haven't read yet, but I've looked at, we're going to find ourselves referring back to 24 again. So I'm looking forward to that.
I got you. That makes sense. The other thing too is, how's the pacing? So we're going maybe roughly 2 or 3 weeks per chapter. Usually 1 week of setup, 1 week getting into the meat of the chapter, and then 1 week talking about how the Middle Ages have affected us and laters and streams throughout history. Is that too slow? Is that too fast? Are you enjoying the pace of that? What do you think?
Given how busy things have been for me in the rest of the week, I've enjoyed being able to slow it down a little bit and think through things in a way that I might not have otherwise been. So I don't think it's too slow of a pace. I do, like I said, I think part of my comments about the next chapter may reflect we might want to think about exactly how we pace the next couple of chapters, because by itself, I'm not sure there's 3 weeks worth of stuff a chapter. But in conjunction with the chapters that come after, I think there's plenty of material in 24. And so that'll be an interesting thing. See how it goes in your reading as well. But I suspect that next week, even if we're just talking about 24, but you'll find that at least in some of my comments, I may be bringing in some things that come later, because they do have, it's really interesting. I think this book has done this a couple of times where they've presented somewhat of a general chapter and then given us some more specifics. And I think this next chapter is one of those general chapters, and it's really good stuff. But sometimes, just like you at the beginning, you talked about the idea of being on a skating rink, and sometimes if you can't get quite enough purchase on that frictionless ice rink, it's hard to grab onto something. There's a little bit of, sometimes you need those specifics to grab onto the ideas of the generalities, and the order they tend to put it is start with the general and move specific. I think we'll find that as we grab onto some of those specifics, that can be very helpful in thinking about the big.
Amen. The other reason why I asked, first of all, my own pacing, I've enjoyed this a lot. No complaints or no pejoratives from my side of the road. I think the one thing I was looking at is we're starting to run out of year here. So 2021 is we're in the fourth quarter. And so as we plan things out, we've just about made it through half of this work in this year. time period. And it makes sense because this was originally a 2-volume bundle, and that actually would have put us in we're about finishing up volume 1 when it was divided. And so I just wanted to check on you. Are you enjoying this to keep moving forward in the coming year in 2022? Is this the right place to spend our time? And your interest level in how we're able to go through things. If we need to make pacing changes to get through this material because there's other good stuff, I completely understand that. But on the other hand, there's a reason why we pay the big bucks to buy these volumes, and that's to get it meat. We can get high-level stuff almost everywhere else. This is really the premium content in terms of getting into the meat. So what are your thoughts? What do you think?
What I would say is this, that I'm good for now. I don't mind if we would, as we look forward to maybe the beginning of next year, looking at what's coming in part 2 and making sure that we're good with spending that much time. I do have some ideas for things that I'd like to do next, but I'm not quite ready to. I like the idea of doing a little bit more in the medieval philosophy because I found it to be very useful in thinking about things. Now, we've done a little bit of a cycle of kind of back and forth, and there is a part of me that would like to keep that going. And when we're done with this, that we go to something that's a little more, that takes into account some of the things that are a little more up to date and what people are thinking about today. I think I'm good with what we're doing now.
All right.